Well, let's talk now to David Bailey, who's Professor of Business Economics at the UK's Birmingham Business School. Good to see you again, David. Thanks for joining us. So why do car manufacturers want Formula One racing teams? To the untrained eye, those cars look completely different, really, to the ones we see in the showrooms. So what's in it for them?
Well, as we heard there, this is a kind of a massively viewed sport around the world. I think last year about 1.5 billion people watched Formula One at some point. In recent years, that popularity has been part fueled by the Netflix series Drive to Survive. So it's reached a younger audience, and increasingly a female audience. On the downside, this season, I think from my own point of view as an F1 view, has been really dull in the sense that Red Bull have completely dominated. So its popularity may have peaked for a while. So I think a lot of sort of brand recognition, a huge audience. The downside, as well, as we heard there, was the huge cost involved doing this. So you've seen some car makers go into Formula One and then out again and then back in. You think of Renault, Honda, Jaguar over the years. The other thing is from a technology point of view, F1 cars today are essentially hybrids. So a lot of the technology that's being developed in Formula One, you can see it almost as a test bed, which is then used in road cars.
I want to ask you about that idea of brand awareness. Obviously, having a Chinese team on the grid would boost that, but does having a bigger brand in Formula One necessarily translate to more family cars sold?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think it does improve the brand image. You think of Ferrari, for example. I mean, as a brand that's worth a great deal, that was built very much around its history in Formula One. It doesn't necessarily equate with more car sales. I mean, probably the most famous story there is Lotus, now owned, of course, by Geely, a Chinese owner. Very successful in F1, but quite a checkered history up until its takeover, at least, in terms of getting cars sold on the road. So there's no guaranteed kind of sale return from the investment in F1.
And when you think of Chinese car makers, you think perhaps of their growth in the EV market in particular. How does Formula One fit in with those rather more eco-friendly credentials?
That's a very good point. F1 is actually a hybrid sport these days. So there's regenerative braking, which puts energy into a battery, which they then use for the boost for overtaking. So it's hybrid. But you are right in the sense that a lot of Chinese car makers are more into the EV market. So Formula E may suit them better. We've seen Neo racing in Formula E, for example. But so it might appeal to some brands. Lotus, owned by Geely. MG, for example, another a brand with a great sporting history. You might imagine those actually going into F1, although not necessarily owning a team, maybe through a brand tie-up in some way.
Well, brand tie-up, sponsorship, that's a bit of a lower commitment way to get involved in a Formula One, isn't it? Do you think we're going to see more Chinese names doing that?
I think that's inevitable. I mean, I think if the Chinese car firms that are emerging, as really big players, BYD, Shanghai Automotive through MG, if Geely, if it wants to re-establish Lotus in a big way, I think it's inevitable we're going to see sponsorship of F1 teams as a way of getting a car brand in front of hundreds of millions of people pretty quickly. So I think that's almost certainly going to happen.
And we have now got one Chinese Formula One driver. What's that done for the sport in China?
I think what's been important with that is it has kept Formula One in the public's imagination. Remember, because of COVID, there have been no F1 races in China since 2019. That was a great shame for the sport because it was doing very well until that point. In 2019, I think about 160,000 people came over the 3 days of the race, and there had been 16 Grand Prix in the country. F1 was hoping to expand in China and have more than one race there. So that's been off the calendar. Coming back next year, having an F1 driver, I think, has at least kept it in the public's imagination and maintained interest in the sport in China.
David, good to speak to you. Thanks, as always, for joining us. That's Professor David Bailey from Birmingham Business School.